Good afternoon. First and foremost, on behalf of the Sports and Entertainment Law Society, Dean McConnell, and the West Virginia University College of Law, I would like to welcome you to Enforcement and Infractions, a panel discussion on the NCAA governing process. Rarely a day goes by without a news story or headline concerning college athletics. What is more, rarely a day goes by, especially in the past year, without a news story or headline regarding an NCAA investigation or infraction. Names like Cam Newton, Terrell Pryor, Jim Tressel, Bruce Pearl, Jim Calhoun, and Rich Rodriguez have in the past year put NCAA rules, regulations, and the enforcement process in the limelight. Whether it be recruiting cookouts, improper text messages, extra practices, or selling championship memorabilia for tattoos, all have implications not only for student athletes, the team and coaches, but athletic departments and universities as a whole. The NCAA and its enforcement and infractions process affects not only those directly involved in college athletics, but each and every student sitting in the classroom across the country. Additionally, the law and university legal departments more than not play an integral role in this process and NCAA governing and enforcement. Today's panel focuses on this process, as well as the controversies surrounding the NCAA and its enforcement. The speakers we have today are both involved in the day-to-day operations of major NCAA Division I athletic departments and scholars in the field of sports law. They carry both a strong basis of knowledge and vast experience. I am sure that their comments will be both educational and insightful. At this time, I would like to turn the mic over to today's first speaker and moderator, WVU College of Law professor Andre Douglas Pond Cummings, graduate of Howard University Law School, former agent and published author.
Thank you, Karina. I'm delighted to be here with all of you today on this distinguished panel. I wanted to particularly shout out the Sports and Entertainment Law Society for their hard work in putting this event together today, and I'm also very grateful to our athletic director, Oliver Luck, our compliance director, Kelly Cunningham, and our resident agent, Ralph Sindrich, for being here with us today.
Excuse me one second. While I'm an agent, I became an attorney before I was an agent. So let's say attorney agent anyway. Keep it a little cleaner.
Our resident attorney and agent, Ralph Sindrich.
That makes me feel more comfortable.
I'm going to introduce briefly our speakers, and then I have a few words to share before I turn the balance of the time over to our guests. Oliver Luck is our athletic director here at West Virginia University. He's a former Mountaineer quarterback and a great friend to the university. Our athletic director, Luck, played in the NFL with the Houston Oilers for a number of years, and since then has been a businessman in sports-related contexts, particularly in leading the World League of American Football, and he also was the CEO of NFL Europe and also president of the Houston Dynamos, and now is our athletic director here at West Virginia University. Also an attorney, graduated from the University of Texas Law School, and so I think Kelly may be the standout non-attorney of the group.
There's somebody with common sense in this panel. That's what that means.
Which you should probably hold proudly. Kelly Cunningham is our Associate Athletic Director for Compliance here at West Virginia University. She worked for the Big East before coming to West Virginia University, and graduated from West Virginia University with a bachelor's degree and a master's degree in our excellent sports management program here at the College of Law, or here at the university. Finally, Ralph Sindrich, who has already mentioned, is an attorney. He's also a former NFL player, current sports agent, played linebacker in the NFL, graduated from the University of Pittsburgh and the South Texas College of Law, represents one of our probably favorite players, those of us that are Pittsburgh Steelers fans, James Ferrier, amongst a group of other distinguished NFL players. Today we aim to look at the NCAA, what it means to comply with the rules and regulations mandated by the National Collegiate Athletic Association, and we hope to look at that from a variety of perspectives. I should mention that before entering law teaching, I was also an agent and had worked with a number of players in negotiating contracts with the NFL. And so we all have very distinct experiences with the NCAA in connection with enforcement. So let me mention two things before turning the balance of our time over to our panelists. First of all, it's very important to recognize that the National Collegiate Athletic Association is a volunteer organization. And that matters very much for the way the NCAA conducts its business. The NCAA was formed historically based on efforts of college and university presidents to manage what's known as sort of the commercialization or the arms race of collegiate athletics. Teddy Roosevelt, around the turn of the 19th century, was very concerned about athletes' injuries, deaths even, that were occurring in college sports, and so began to form organizations that would mandate rules and regulations for collegiate athletics. That organization eventually became the NCAA. It is a volunteer organization in that each university has the opportunity to decide to become a member of the NCAA. So as a volunteer organization, the NCAA has the ability to promulgate rules and regulations that are primarily instigated by university presidents. Around the 1980s and 1990s, the governance or leadership of the NCAA changed to the point where university presidents became the leading bodies of sort of what the rules and regulations were going to be in regulating collegiate athletics. And one of the interesting keys about the NCAA being a volunteer organization is that any university can decide to opt out. You don't have to comply with NCAA regulations if you don't choose to be a member of the NCAA. If you don't like the rules and regulations, simply don't be a member. Much like the MPAA, the Motion Picture Academy, that rates movies, that's also a voluntary organization. Anyone that puts a movie up to be rated is doing so voluntarily. It doesn't have to. But as I'm sure you can imagine, if you choose not to have a movie rated or if you choose not to be a member of the NCAA, there are significant problems and repercussions that come with that. So the NCAA wields a great amount of power due to its voluntary organization stature. The second important point that I'll make in connection with enforcement is that a very landmark, very important Supreme Court case, Tarkanian versus the NCAA, solidified the power of the National Collegiate Athletic Association when I'm sure many of you are familiar with Jared Tarkanian's long feud with the NCAA. In particular, in the 1980s, the NCAA decided that Tarkanian had broken a myriad of its rules and ordered the University of Nevada, Las Vegas to terminate Tarkanian. Tarkanian sued the NCAA because he claimed his due process rights had been violated. Pleased to see many first-year law students in this room. Due process requires that before life, liberty, or property is taken from you by the government or the state, you must be given due process of law, the opportunity to defend yourself, the opportunity to hear the charges against you, the opportunity to confront those that testify against you. Well, Tarkanian basically argued that the NCAA was a state actor and that his due process rights had been violated. Many of those that came forward in providing information to the NCAA against Tarkanian were unknown, or they were unknown sources to Tarkanian. He wasn't able to cross-examine many of the people that made charges against him. And his claim was that the NCAA, as a state actor, had violated his due process rights. Well, Justice Stevens and the United States Supreme Court, in a close 5-4 decision, decided that the NCAA, in fact, is not a state actor, that it is a voluntary organization, that each university that chooses to be a part of the NCAA can choose not to be. And so even though the NCAA was ordering UNLV, a state institution, to terminate Tarkanian, he, in fact, was not being ordered by a state entity to be terminated. UNLV could choose to comply or choose to be punished by the NCAA or choose to be written out of the NCAA organization. And so this is important because NCAA enforcement and infractions do not, per the Tarkanian case, require due process. So all of these rights that protect individuals when they are being challenged by state government actors don't attend NCAA rules and regulations. Due process does not apply because the Supreme Court found that the NCAA is not a state actor. With those two things in place, what I hope that we've set up to do today is talk about the role of the NCAA, how it chooses to enforce, whether the infractions that it promulgates are fair, and in fact, whether it makes sense to spend, I would imagine, an inordinate amount of time as an athletic director or as a compliance director keeping up with all of the rules and regulations that the NCAA puts in place in order to be a university that can compete on a level playing field without running afoul of the NCAA rules and regulations. So with those things in place, I'm very happy to turn the mic over to our athletic director, Oliver Luck, to talk about enforcement and infractions.
Thank you, Professor Cummings. I appreciate the invitation to come out and spend some time with you. I'll keep my remarks fairly limited. First, though, let me introduce two folks in the audience who have, in different ways, a variety of experiences with the NCAA. First of all, our faculty athletic representative, Professor John Fisher. John knows more about the NCAA and athletics than probably all of us combined. Thank you for coming, John. And also our excellent men's head soccer coach, Marlon LeBlanc. And Marlon's experience with the NCAA, but beyond doing the compliance that he as a head coach is obligated to do, he inherited our men's soccer program, 5 years ago, Marlon? After it had been placed on, I guess, what's the right term, Kelly? Major violation. It was found guilty of a major violation, which is it's difficult enough to be a head coach in any one of the sports, but to take over a program that just got reprimanded by the NCAA was particularly challenging. So let me just make 4 or 5 fairly quick points. Number one, I'm relatively new to the NCAA because I've only been involved professionally in intercollegiate athletics for the past 9 months or so. And so I've got probably a relatively fresh set of eyes looking at the NCAA and the relationship between the NCAA and our institution and the relationship between the NCAA, our conference, the Big East, and our institution because it's a relatively new experience for me. As Kelly knows, when I hired her back in September, was it? I said, listen, the most important thing that we have to do is follow the rules. Simply put, no exceptions, no caveats, no ifs, ands, or buts. We have to follow the rules. And I think as evidence of that, we've actually hired an assistant football coach who has a law school degree, or a degree from Harvard University Law School. So we're embedding smart people, agents of truth and justice in our own football program to make sure we follow the rules. But seriously, the NCAA rule book is thick. And I'm not sure there's anybody that really knows it backwards and forwards. It's like reading the commercial code or any of the. So what we've tried to develop, and Kelly's done a marvelous job with this, and I'm 100% supportive, is to raise the sensitivity level of all of our coaches, our donors, other university representatives to pick up the phone and call. They just need to have a sensitivity that virtually every question they would have needs to be answered by a professional as opposed to trying themselves to figure out what the rule book means because it's very challenging. A couple of sort of big picture things. As I mentioned, number one, compliance is extraordinarily important to our university. We are in a position right now where we've been accused of 2 major violations, one in men's soccer, one in football, within the past 5 years. That allows the NCAA to levy enhanced penalties. So we have no wiggle room. We've got no extra rope. The ice is thin. Use whatever analogy you want to use. We have to really, toe the straight and narrow path. And we're very serious about doing that. In terms of the NCAA, I'll just say a couple of things. Number one, it's become an enormous organization. As a student athlete here in the late 70s, early 80s, we did not have a compliance officer. Our first compliance officer, I think, was Roger Jeffries, who started mid-80s maybe. So when I was in school, there was no compliance. Coaches had university rules to follow. We weren't a member of a conference back then, so there were no conference rules. And I'm sure there were some NCAA mandates and rules that coaches had to follow, but this is a relatively new profession. In other words, 40 years ago, you wouldn't find people like Kelly working in compliance, and all sorts of stuff went on in the old days, and we'll just leave it at that. But it's become an enormous organization. Intercollegiate athletics is as popular now as it's ever been, and that's a good thing. There's more money now than we've ever seen in intercollegiate athletics. But the entire NCAA organization is really based on, I think, a couple of very simple premises. One of those premises is the concept of amateurism. which is a very nice, quaint British concept that comes from the old Chariots of Fire days, right? And, you know, Oxford, Thames guys rowing and all that. So the whole concept is based on a very quaint notion of amateurism. And those of you who are my age, I'm 51, may remember when the Olympics were all about amateurs. And we would send our college basketball team to go play the Russians, right? Well, that all changed in the early 90s with our dream team. And the Olympics, the worldwide movement for the amateur athlete, abandoned the amateur concept. So the amateur concept, as was mentioned with some of the cases that have been in the newspapers recently, the amateur concept is really under attack from a whole variety of different sides. The new NCAA president, a fellow named Mark Emmert, former chancellor at the University of Washington system, chancellor of the Louisiana State system, very smart guy. He has pledged to uphold the amateur concept, and I really do believe he will. But there are numerous attacks on the amateur concept, which really is the foundation for, I think, for the NCAA and for their rule making, the promulgation of their rules and regulations. The second piece, I think, is that the NCAA is also based to a large degree on a university's willingness to self-police. As Kelly may mention, the rule book is thick. Our coaches make mistakes all the time. We encourage our coaches to report those mistakes. Technology is a big part of what the NCAA has to regulate now, and literally if a coach pushes the wrong button on his cell phone and sends a text in a window when texts aren't allowed, that's a secondary violation which we have to report. So it's extraordinarily important that all of our coaches feel as though they can come to us, the administration, and say, hey, I made a mistake, I apologize. So that's self-policing is a big part of what needs to happen, because there are, I'm not sure how many members in the NCAA, but between the Division I schools and the Division I AA and Division II and Division III, there must be over 1,000 institutions that are a part of the NCAA. And there are a myriad of rules. So we really want to encourage our folks, as all universities do, to be very forthright, very upfront, and report their secondary and, if this is the case, their major violations, because we need to be completely transparent, both with our conference, which has its own set of rules, as well as with the NCAA. So I would just want to kind of throw out those very brief points, and I'll turn the microphone over to Kelly Cunningham, our very talented Associate AD for Compliance and Governance.
I spoke previously in the semester at Professor Cummings' course, so hopefully, some of the concepts we talk about today aren't going to be repeated. That was an excellent discussion and dialogue that existed in that room, and so I appreciate the opportunity to come back and chat with you as a whole. I'm going to touch on 3 topics. These came as recommendation from Karina, so thank you, Karina, for helping me with my thoughts. It takes me out of the rule book and gives me specifics to focus on. But those concepts will include institutional control, what that means, really the basis of what we're here to do with that, the role that the compliance office as a whole plays with the NCAA, and then some common controversies that exist throughout the world of compliance. Institutional control, really in simple format, is just to make sure that we're doing our jobs, that we have policies and procedures in place that curb, prevent violations, but that we're following those policies and procedures to make sure that everybody's on the same page and basis of what exists within the rule book, of how they should be operating, and that we're following up, on a daily basis to make certain that we are, in fact, monitoring activities to catching the fact that if you do have violations, or that we create this atmosphere where coaches are not only promoting compliance, but also reporting in the event that they have problems. That's accomplished through a number and variety of ways. It's a never-ending task, but the basis of that all starts with rules education. Obviously, we're considered, if you will, in the eyes of many as the experts of the rule book. And outside of that rule book, there's thousands of interpretations that exist as part of the educational efforts. And so we'll do standard practices surrounding Rules Ed. That includes, monthly educational meetings with our coaches. Obviously, we target them more frequently than others. General staff Rules Ed, usually on a term-by-term basis, registrar's office, financial aid, alumni, boosters, you name it. We're charged with making sure we address every single one of those individuals who could potentially be impacted by the rules, because ultimately if you find yourselves in a problem, the NCAA and the big question when they establish institutional control is going to be, what did you do to prevent this? And the last place you need to find yourself in is saying, well, we didn't do anything. So, just as an example, we touched on the situation Coach LeBlanc came into a number of years ago surrounding their major infraction. And what did we do today in our Rules Ed meeting? We talked about a policy that's in place for the upcoming summer to make certain that we don't repeat those issues that existed in that major infraction. What you never want to see, aside from a big problem, is repeating a particular problem. And so within that major infraction, we had some issues where we had prospective student athletes coming into campus, receiving impermissible expenses and benefits, and the compliance office didn't have any justification or knowledge that they were here, staying at places they shouldn't have been, receiving transportation, et cetera. So we will meet with each prospective student athlete coming into the institution who is here on their own dime to say, where are you staying, how are you paying your way, what transportation exists, and we'll work with the rules and interpretations to try and find ways to make certain that we're on top of that. We've seen over the past, and I've been a part of this for about 10 years, and to say that compliance has gotten to a level of where it never was is an understatement. I think probably within the past 5 years you're seeing the biggest push, whether that's because nationally more issues are being identified or the rules are just getting more complex. But at the end of the day, it's a situation and a scenario where we're on a much larger scale and a heightened awareness than I think we used to be. I can remember 10 years ago being in the compliance office at West Virginia University, and it just wasn't at the level, and I don't say West Virginia and their compliance, but just compliance as a whole and what it meant to the NCAA and what it is today. So to see it 10 years later and where it's at and the magnitude that exists obviously is something that I think institutions across the country take a lot of attention to. Obviously, they have to do that, and it's very important. The power factor that Professor Cummings talked about is the biggest piece of what exists in this whole concept, because at the end of the day, I can certainly sit here and I can find thousands of people to band with me and say some of these rules are absolute nonsense. It's ridiculous, some of the things that exist there, but at the end of the day, that doesn't matter because the NCAA holds the power on that. And if we say, well, that's nonsense, I'm not going to abide by that, or I don't care, or that doesn't make sense, then guess what? We've found ourselves in a major problem. And so one of the things that I try and help our coaches, our staff, our student athletes to understand is none of this is ever personal. While it may not make a lot of sense, and some of it is, complete nonsense, we have to follow these rules. It's not personal, and that's the parameter that exists. So one of the other things that I do want you to understand is that, compliance offices, while the rules and the regulations and the legislation is a big part of that, we're also heavily involved in just the day-to-day operations of what it means for a prospect to come to this campus and venture through as a student athlete. There's really 8 areas of particular emphasis within the rule book and the bylaws, and that surrounds some of the pieces of, initial enrollment and eligibility. We have someone who focuses primarily on financial aid, awards and benefits, money-type factors that surround things. I have a individual in our department whose primary focus is rules ed and monitoring, another gentleman who's responsible for eligibility, whether it's initial eligibility or continuing eligibility. And so their day-to-day responsibilities are part of making this whole system run. But all of that is based and founded on the rules. So it's a never-ending process from that standpoint. And part of what happens in a compliance office and what dictates what we do are some of these controversies. So, one of the topics were, well, what are the common controversies that exist? And common, obviously would be, we've heard it for years, we're going to continue to hear about it, is this concept of paying student athletes. I could talk for days as to whether or not I feel like we should pay student athletes, whether they're already paid and those types of things that exist. All of that is largely founded on this basis of amateurism and what exists there for them. Other controversies, obviously, throughout the years, it seems like it kind of runs in trends, and you'll structure a lot of your focus around it. But in the fall, we had the agent blow up, as I like to call it, where you saw so much emphasis and issues erupting in identification of agent issues. And now you're seeing where the NCAA has put together, panel discussion people and individuals to try and say, well, what do we want to do to make this better? Would it help to establish a calendar where we permit agents to have a contact period with student athletes, similar to a contact period for prospective students with coaches? Would it help for them to establish their own professional sports counseling panel and take that out of the institution's hands? So, those types of things. But because of what happened with agents and those types of issues, we obviously were charged then with strengthening our efforts. Because as soon as you see something nationally hit the scale, you immediately go to your desk and say, okay, what are we doing here? Are we in good shape? Is this an area of concern for us? Because what you assume is that at some point in time, the NCAA, in the event you have an issue, is going to say, you didn't see HBO? You didn't, Google UNC athletics and know what's going on there? What do you mean you haven't discussed anything with anyone? So in response to that, one of the things we did in the fall is we hosted an educational, weekend, if you will, with our student athletes and parents of student athletes. We brought back 2 former student athletes who had some involvement in the agent business, we spent some time in the professional ranks to talk to them about this. One of the things that I've always said is I'm certainly in no position to walk in front of a group of football players and say, hey guys, let me tell you about the professional world, because they're going to look at me and say, who the heck is this chick? So we take initiatives to do that. And a controversy obviously now coming down the pipeline surrounds the recruiting services. Rivals, I don't know if anyone's familiar or saw that blow up last week with Rivals and Scout and the subscriptions to those. And that's an area that is extremely challenging, because immediately you find yourselves at your desk, you see the headline go forward that everyone's banned from Rivals and Scout.com. And by the way, you've got violations if you're a part of it. Well, every institution across the country is a part of that. So the way that you deal with that and you address that is you pick up the phone and call some colleagues and say, okay, what are you doing? I got 3 calls, so it made me feel good about myself, the fact that people are picking up the phone to say, let's call Kelly Cunningham and see what she's doing. I don't know if that's a good or bad thing, but I took a little pride in it. And you assess the situation to determine how you're going to move forward. But those controversies are the types of things that dictate what we do on a basis outside of just those general parameters that you have to have. So with that said, I hope I touched on those 3 topics. Obviously, I think at the end we'll have an opportunity for a Q&A, and I'll go ahead and turn it over.
Well, thank you. Ralph Sindrich, again, is my name. I know a little bit about this stuff, having been in it in all my life. Was an All-American football player, All-American wrestler, states and whatever else. Had over 100 scholarships, so I got offered a lot of nice things. I was never offered what the guy down at Ohio State was offered, the one who was offered to have sex if he signed there. I certainly would have signed there at that time, I can tell you that. I was recruited heavily by West Virginia University. They took me hunting, seriously. They took me hunting on a farm, shooting pheasants. I was looking for women. In my view, the NCAA is a total fraud. It's a sham. The idea of amateurism is a sham. It's been going on from the beginning of time to somehow put in these innate archaic rules at this day and age. It doesn't make any sense. This is $1 billion business, folks. I mean, you're talking about big-time dollars. Everybody's making it except the players. You look at this and you look in any other marketplace and you say, what happens when you have an influx of the marketplace? What happens when you have too many people or too much that's going out there or products that are hard to get? The value of those products, generally, if you have an influx of those products, they go down. What happens when you have a free agent in football? His price goes way up. One of the reasons is because there aren't too many that make it. Everybody could have, would have, should have, maybe could have played. Or they didn't have this injury here. I blew my knee. I think I could have been All-Pro, maybe in the Hall of Fame. I'm not real serious on that. But at certain things and points in your career, events happen. But I was able to see it all firsthand. I experienced it, and I had the offers. And fortunately, I had some very good guidance, but that's not the same with everybody else. You know, you look at this, and what's the percentage out there of kids that actually make it? High school players, 0.02%. Anyone ever played high school, you make it to the pros. What about colleges? 9%. 9% of the guys in colleges. You know, when you come down to it, I don't know, anybody ever watch that Bull Durham show? All right. Know what the difference between hitting 250 and 300 is? It's 25 hits. 25 hits and 500 at bats is 50 points. There's about 6 months in the season. That's about 26 weeks. That means if you get just one extra flare a week, just one, you get a ground ball. You get a ground ball with eyes. You get a gorp. You get a dying quail. Just one more dying quail a week, and you're in Yankee Stadium. Now, that's the difference. That's the difference between all the guys who could have, should have, and quite frankly, if they'd gotten a better shot, they probably could have. So there's a lot of people after them. There's a lot of people that want to get them into the colleges and the universities. Then you have pimps out there like Nick Saban. Can I be sued for saying anything like if I were to call something like Rachel you up there, and could I be sued for calling Nick Saban or Myers, both of them pimps together? And let me throw in Kiffin too, Lane Kiffin from USC.
This is being webcast live.
Yes.
So
Tell me, do I have any? And you know what I say to him? Bring it on. I know where all the dead bodies are, fellas. All right? I know how you operate it. I've seen you. I've covered for you even a time or two. All right? NCAA football is a dirty business. All right? I don't care how you break it down, you shake it down. We talk to these nice people here, and everybody says good, nice things. But the fact of the matter is, if you're in a Final Four game and you want to bring your relatives in, as a player, you can't legitimately and legally do it. You can't do it you can't do it with the championship games. What about the concussions you get? What about later on in life? It's going to happen. It happens to all the guys out there where you're losing something. You know, some of them never had it to begin with. But if you're losing, you know, your mental faculties, who pays for that? What about your knees? You ever go to an NFL alumni convention or even NCAA Hall of Fame over in Indianapolis, right? It's Indianapolis. Are you in that? Are you in that?
I don't want to be a member of a club that wants me as a member. That's my theory.
Well, you certainly deserve to be in. And it is an outstanding organization. But the way you see these rules and how silly, really just stupid they are. And then you add in one other dimension. And let me say what I do. I do a lot of expert witness work. And I'm not the smartest guy in the world. Hey, I play football. Worse, I wrestled. All right? So it doesn't put me in a high category. But I think like a lot of successful people out there, I must include myself, but what I strive to do and what I strive to see is keeping at it, not quitting. The biggest thing that makes any individual a success in any part of what they do is just not quitting, having the wherewithal just to keep going. And certainly college football, I love it. I mean, it gave me just about everything that I possibly could have, along with pro ball that put me with the Houston Oilers into South Texas College of Law, a much better law school. And starting that way and being able to see and just feel it as it goes along. But I get irked to no end when I hear some of these clowns, these coaches. You say it's webcast again. Saban, Myers, Kiffin, all right? I'll give you my address. Come look me up. And really, I've made this challenge. I've made it out on Facebook and Twitter, and I've made it about every forum. And you know what? If old Nicky wants to go in the back room and just throw down with me, I'm talking about Nick Saban, I'd sure like to do that for a little bit of time. All right? And so somebody sees him, pass it on. Why? Because, in my opinion, these guys are just pure and simple pigs. They're not academians. They're not real good teachers. They're not what they represent or tend to try to represent, nor the universities and colleges. It's all about money, and it's all about the bottom line, and it is a billion-dollar industry. I can go through a litany, don't have the time, of all the great exchanges that took place of universities playing one another, going back to 1922, 1918, 1935. What about the day after Thanksgiving when you'd always have that big-time game that went on? It was, Colorado, and who would Colorado play day after? Oklahoma, was it? Colorado and Oklahoma, done. All because of greed, all because of money. It's a big-time business. Now you have these major marketers coming in. I used to be president of IMG Football, International Management Group Football. Some good boys there. You know what? You start taking it past college now and going into high school, someone got to draw a line. Someone got to say, that's taking it too far. And there's one other thing going on, and I'll conclude and maybe open up. I don't know if I've said anything just other than take a lot of shots, which was intended. And I'm not the smartest guy in the world anyway. That's whatever comes to my mind. For everybody, how many are law students in here? First off, you become a lawyer. You practice law, you know law, and you do it the proper way. You don't ever have to lie. You don't ever have to cheat, ever, in your business, in your profession. I say this out on Twitter, publicly. There's an agent under every rock out there. If I were to misrepresent one time, I would have a challenge. No one's either has enough money or has the goods or smart enough to make that challenge to me. Because I never broke a rule, ever. I never lied and never cheated, and I kept records that came in of every call and everything that went on, and so that I knew. So I take offense. If you're going to call me a pimp, you better be ready to fight, because I don't take kindly to that. And I'm sure there are a lot of other outstanding coaches that would take offense to some of the things that I say, but all my life, my mentors have been coaches. So really, in concluding on this thing, and I'll open it up to really any type of question, if the NFL sides up with the NCAA in trying to form some type of a boycott or whatever, and particularly hitting on the agents and all that. And look, folks, I don't make my money at agency anymore. I make a lot more money than I did when I was doing that in other areas. I don't make a lot more money. But I had some other things happen, whatever else. So maybe I have a license to be able to get away with this stuff. But if the NCAA and the NFL get together, they are going to have one of their worst nightmares in me, in court, and in Congress, because I'm here to say I don't think there's a match for me as an expert witness in this business. No one's done it as long. No one's played. No one's gone to law school, and no one's been through the number of trials, over 20, that I've been through as an expert witness. And I know the facts, and I know where the bodies are. So I'm looking forward to that day if the NFL is dumb enough to join up with the NCAA on that, and it's being mentioned right now, to where they would combine their resources together or whatever else. So those are just my feelings on it. Feel free to bring up anything you have.
I wanted to thank all of our speakers for their dynamic presentations. 2 quick comments before we open it up for questions. Ralph Sindrich is referencing Nick Saban's pretty famous remarks last year, calling agents pimps and saying that the NCAA football is messed up because of the agent business. So that's what the reference is there. The interesting connection that I think we've all built here, that I hope we can address in Q&A, is that, from our athletic director, Oliver Luck's perspective as sort of overseeing a program, and Kelly's perspective as far as compliance is concerned, it's mandated rules that exist in a culture that we have to live in. It doesn't make any sense for a university to withdraw from the NCAA, at least at this point in time. So Ralph Sindrich is talking about a system that's a sham. Setting it up as, is the NCAA really about amateurism, or is it about a $771 million television contract to show March Madness? And who does that benefit and how? So we've set the NCAA up as an overseer of sorts that we have to comply with, and we've set it up as a sham in connection with, does it really effectuate any of the sort of stated goals which is sort of protecting this sort of pure idea of amateurism for student athletes. And so with those things on the table, I'd like to hear from you. So because it's being webcast live, please step to the microphone to answer your questions. We've got about 15 or 20 minutes for Q&A.
My question is relative to the recent O'Bannon versus NCAA case as far as imagery goes. How the NCAA justifies keeping the image in perpetuity for athletes who've only been there for 4 years. Recently, the Upper Deck uses only the licensing, NCAA licensing in their sports cards. I believe Oscar Robertson's joined in the suit. I don't understand how these students, athletes, are losing their images for perpetuity because they come as an 18-year-old, sit there in the compliance office, look at the compliance person, probably sleep half the time, wake up and then sign 20 papers in there. I mean, it's maybe towards compliance as far as, have you ever had somebody not sign their paper saying, I don't want to waive my image to the university and the NCAA can promote me? Thanks.
That's a good question because what he's referencing is part of what's known as a student-athlete statement. It's 7 different pieces, but a piece of that basically provides a clearance to the NCAA to use a student-athlete's name, image, appearance, et cetera, in order to promote the NCAA as a whole, their activities, their events, their programs, their championships. And there's a piece in that statement and the bylaw that exists attached to it that says, if you do not sign the statement in its truest form of all 7 parts, you are not eligible to represent the institution in intercollegiate competition. And so, have I ever had a student athlete, decline signing it? No. Have I had student athletes ask, what happens if I don't sign it? Yes. And the answer to that student athlete is, if you don't sign that, you don't go on the field. You don't go in the pool. You don't go on the court. And so it's set up in a sense that they sign that because if they otherwise chose not to, they would not participate.
Just to contextualize the question a bit, Ed O'Bannon played for UCLA, won the basketball championship several years ago, and was startled, I think, to find his image being used by EA Sports on a sort of a basketball video game. And Ed O'Bannon, because he signed this paperwork, has no ability to profit in any respect from the millions, if not billions of dollars that these that the NCAA has used to sell the rights or license to these video games. So Ed O'Bannon is currently suing the NCAA, and I'm not exactly sure where the status of the lawsuit is right now. It's in appeals court?
Yeah, it is. It's ongoing. I mean, that's a big case, and certainly most of the law students have it. There's one other thing they forgot to mention as far as those compliance papers or other garbage that they give you at that time, and it's adhesive. There's no way. You want to go to the school, you've already been wine and dined, you already had that date with that girl, and you want to go to that school, and they put that in front of you and say, you got to sign it. All right? Tell me at that point, what are you going to do? And I'll tell you another thing that really ticks me off about that, and I couldn't figure it out. I'm over in law school, and I'm teaching, and I was recruited, and I know what everybody was saying to me at the time. It was a long time ago. But it was, once you come here, you're here. You're a part of it. You don't lose your scholarship now. You do some really bad things if you're a dumb kid, in a sense of not attending classes, doing the other things, you're going to lose it. But now, at the option, correct me if I'm wrong here, at the option of the university, after you're getting recruited, after you're being made all these promises to, and by the way, in law that's called fraud. If you make a direct representation, it's relied upon, and you act upon it, and you're damaged, and getting booted out of the university would be damaging. That happens now. Tell me how that comes about. I don't know. When did that come about? And please tell me why and how a coach can sit in a family's living room and make all these promises and then on the second year bounce them out. And that happens.
Contracts are renewable on a year-to-year basis. So if you sign with the school, you don't get 4 years.
But he can't leave, can he? Or she?
Well,
he can leave without sitting out? No.
Not in sports other than football and basketball. But well, and that's something that too, so that you understand that agreement. Your scholarship is renewable on an annual basis. So at the end of that term, they can cancel it for any reason, whether it's athletic or non-athletically related. You do have an opportunity to then appeal the scholarship that goes to a committee outside of the athletics department, usually through the normal channels of financial aid, similar to merit aid. And that opportunity exists during the period of the award. You can't take it, reduce it, cancel it for any reason other than, severe disciplinary problems if they misrepresent their application. So just so you kind of understand how that works. But there is no 4-year scholarship, although some believe that it does exist.
I can't listen to the conversation without sharing with you the famous line by the former University of Texas basketball coach, Abe Lemons, who was a very funny guy back in the 60s. He said, "Doctors bury their mistakes. Coaches keep them on scholarship." But having said what Ralph pointed out and what Kelly just said, it's pretty rare, and I'll ask Coach LeBlanc, one of our coaches, it's very rare that a coach kicks a kid off a scholarship unless there's a real legitimate and serious reason. It's true they're all 1-year renewable contracts, but I think, and coaches make mistakes because the art of recruiting is just that, it's an art and not a science. But it's very rare that a student athlete is kicked off of a scholarship because he or she didn't develop like the coach expected to. That's part of the, I think the approach that most coaches take, almost all coaches take.
Hi, my name is Jenna Emerson, and I'd like to thank the panel for coming. I have 2 questions for you. The first is just, I have no background in sports law, so Kelly, you had alluded to the idea that about agents in the NCAA. Could you elaborate more in terms of are they allowed to be represented, or student athletes allowed to be represented when they're in college, and how does that work? And then the second question I had is that you also discussed this idea of the different rules in conferences and how different conferences have different rules. And I was wondering if those were huge differences and if that led to conference shopping on behalf of the student athlete because the rules were so different. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll start with the conference rules that exist, and that's something, just so you're aware, we actually have very little discussion on a day-to-day basis with the NCAA. If you're not dealing with a waiver, you're not dealing with enforcement on some sort of infraction or series of violations, most of your communication and correspondence go through the Big East, your designated conference, and then they then have a liaison to the NCAA that in the event you want to try and escalate an issue or ask for a higher level of interpretation, you can go through that. But for a compliance person to pick up the phone and call the NCAA, that's very unusual, just so that everyone's clear on that. Conference offices can adopt rules and regulations that exist in addition to the NCAA rules. For example, it's common for conferences to have what's known as an interconference transfer rule. Basically what that will say is if you're a student athlete participating in a sport, you transfer to someone within the conference, you not only have to sit a year, which is a comment that Ralph commented on with just general transfer rules, but in addition to sitting that full year of residence and not being able to compete, you also lose a year of eligibility. So if they had 4 years of eligibility, now they're down to 3. Another common rule that you'll see within conferences is a non-qualifier policy. Basically what that says is certain conferences have adopted rules to say we will not accept a non-qualifier. The NCAA rule that exists says that as a non-qualifier, you can go to an institution and you can be a part of the team, but you can't have any financial aid, athletics aid that's from the athletics department. In addition to that, you can't be eligible to compete, but you have to sit for a year. The Big East and many of the Big Six conferences, I know the ACC has it, I'm not certain for the other ones, but it's my understanding, it exists with it largely in the Big Six conferences, has what's known as we don't accept non-qualifiers policy. And basically what that says is even though the NCAA will let you come in and sit for a year, the conference office will not. And therefore, if you're a non-qualifier, you have to go and attend a 4-year institution or a 2-year institution and meet a higher level of regulations to transfer in. So those exist, which impact, obviously, the NCAA rules. And then, of course, conferences have the opportunity to adopt their own sport policies that are more of the championship governance and the playing seasons, which are somewhat separate from the NCAA. To talk a little bit about the agent piece of her question and whether or not student athletes can be represented at the collegiate level, the answer to that is no. Within the amateurism rules in bylaw 12, it specifically says that in the event you agree to any type of contractual obligation, whether that's verbally or in writing with an agent, you're immediately ineligible for competition moving forward and you forfeit all eligibility that remains. Now, that's where you're going to get into a discussion of, Okay, well, how do you police that? Are you tapping into someone's phone? Do you possess telepathic powers? And I'm actually a proponent of allowing agents to speak with student athletes in certain scenarios. I think to say to a student athlete, you can't talk with an agent, which, just so you're aware, it's actually permissible for agents to talk with student athletes. You'll see many institutions adopt policies that exist that says we ask that you don't talk to them until they're finished and they're exhausted their eligibility. I have a bit of a concern with that based upon the fact that my feeling is if you tell a student athlete they can't even talk to an agent, maybe they have questions that can't exist, maybe that you're basically closing off that door to in some ways force them to go have the conversations on their own without any oversight from a coaching staff member or compliance. But then the other end of the flip of that coin is if you open up that door, well, what are they talking about? Are they agreeing to contractual obligations? Are they, potentially setting up something that shouldn't exist within the rules? So the basic response to that is no, you can't agree to any type of agreement. But
Took me everything I possibly could to let you get through with that, because it is the height of naivete that you would think that college students aren't approached by agents, that they aren't accepting money, that they're going to listen to some stupid rule by a coach or somebody else. Keep one thing in mind. Coaches, too, they're all represented. And, we talk about this rules enforcement. They leave. They leave all the time. Coaches leave all the time, break their rules. They don't sit out a year. What about the violations? Reggie Bush. Reggie Bush got his Heisman taken away. How was USC penalized? Did they lose anything? They get back any bowl money? Did any of those things happen? And just the other part coming in on a law professor part, this is a tremendous position, particularly for ladies, could be for anyone, but particularly for ladies, for breaking into the industry. And this whole area is a good area, along with drugs. I mean, become a pharmacist. It's all out there. It's on an international basis. They're testing for every single thing now. And look, you can make one heck of a good living as a DWI attorney or DUI attorney, all right? Intoxication, whatever else. It's only a step beyond to get into this part of it as far as testing and having a nice profession that way, which is certainly a lot better than being an agent. One of the coaches sometimes mentions out there, too, is Tressel. And this is another thing that ticked me off, and you alluded to it. Who is the NCAA to say to a coach, you must report this violation, or else this is going to happen or that's going to happen? And if he reports the violation, his students are then federally indicted or criminally on a state basis indicted. What right does the NCAA have to even suggest they have that type of power over the United States Constitution? If there's anything that irks me off about these boys, that does probably more than anything. I would love, on a series of issues to your Mr. Director, the NCAA, Mr. Emmert, whatever he is, I'd love to face him one-on-one on a number of these issues, and particularly then when you start getting into the dollars and the cents and everything else, there is absolutely no defense. The NCAA has no defense to the rules they have in place, and if they over-push it, they're going to get shot down big time in the courts.
Ralph,
And I'll help.
Did you sleep okay last night?
No. This subject is one, and it's always with the agents. You want to know something? All right, you got the agent, you got the coaches out there. Everybody knows the violations. What happens to them? They go on and they get another job. You got the coach for University of Indiana, went from wherever he went from, Oklahoma State. He had recruiting violations. What do? They bring him in, they give him a nice big contract. Nothing bad ever happens. You want to know what happens to an agent? If an agent goes down to Louisiana, state of Louisiana, contacts properly the head coach, the athletic director, after the Secretary of State, then he can have a meeting. Now, what are the chances of him getting a meeting if he contacts the coach and says, I want to sit down in your office, right outside your office, on your couch, and I want to talk to an individual about the facts of life and what's going to be coming up and some of the things he can do, not only help himself, but to help your ball club? What do you think is going to happen? And if you don't do it, what is it? It's a freaking felony. It's a felony for an agent not to do that. And Alabama, where old Nikki is, down in Louisiana, where Nikki was, and a lot of other different places you have that. And what I'm saying to you is there are a lot of discrepancies right there. But I did sleep very well.
Before the next question, let me just mention, I don't know about Ralph's experience. When I was meeting with players about potential representation, many times the players wanted to know, they just wanted information. Where am I, what are teams saying about me? Where might I go in the draft? What, there were the players that said, what do you got for me? And like Ralph, I always said, I got nothing for you except information until your eligibility is exhausted, and then we can help you with workouts and what have you. But my experience was most of the kids just wanted information. They wanted to know if they had a future in the league and if they had an opportunity to play and whether they should come out early or not. And the NCAA has some things that can sort of help with that. But some players did want stuff, but for the most part, the players that I talked to just wanted information. And
What were the draft choices? How did they end up going in the draft? How highly recruited were they, and where did they go in the draft?
The ones that I was talking to?
Yes, the ones you're saying, that's all they wanted was information. Because the guys I talked to were first-round draft choices. In the spring, we're looking for tens of thousands of dollars.
Yeah. Before their eligibility was up.
Oh, hell yeah. Come on.
Well, so that's the other thing. The ones that did want something had already been offered. The first-round draft picks and the others that I talked to had already been offered all kinds of stuff. So their question really was, what do you got? And my thing was, I got nothing. But I got love for you and information, which didn't always win the day.
Two questions. One, Nick Saban actually does this a lot. Oversigning players. I know it's more a football thing, like oversigning.
I'm sorry, I missed what he was saying. I'm sorry.
Oversigning recruits as a football team, people get locked up from making decisions. And secondly, I know the NCAA now is there's a lot of issues with looking at the kids' juvenile records before they sign a letter of intent. You can't open up that stuff. And how do you feel about looking at the juvenile records?
For the juvenile records piece, and that's something that Oliver could probably chat about, so I'll defer to him. I have my thoughts on it, but I'll focus more so on your other question with the oversigning. And basically what he's talking about is each individual sport has certain scholarship limitations that they can't exceed. So for football, you're looking at 85. If you're looking at an equivalency sport, they divide it up. And oversigning is where you find yourself offering out more aid than exists in the event that everybody decides to attend the institution. There aren't really any rules and regulations that preclude you from actually issuing that aid. This past year in the legislative cycle, they tried to sponsor a proposal specific to baseball, which basically said that you couldn't even issue it. That ended up being defeated. But for a coach to oversign his class, I'm not going to say that's not uncommon. They find ways around it and to make it work, whether that's, deferring them to mid-year, such as a gray shirt, as you hear that term, or talking to the kid to say, look, I oversigned the class. I don't have aid for you anymore. I would like to believe that that's going to hurt him in recruiting him or her and try and curb some of those things. But what that means to a compliance person, and when we see it, obviously you can imagine it's a source of a bit of anxiety, because if you ultimately oversign your class, let's take football, for example, and they go out and commit 86 scholarships and they only have 85, and you go to that 86 kid and say, I'm sorry, we're going to go ahead and defer you. And he says, no, you're not. I signed that. That's my scholarship. And now he forces you to hold that aid. Then basically what that means is you've oversigned your class. That's a 2-for-1 penalty for the NCAA. And now moving forward, not only do you have a blatant violation that existed, knowing the rule, you went out and gambled with it, but on top of that, they're reducing you the following year by at least 2 scholarships. You just dropped to 83. And you've got kids coming back that potentially are needing that aid, and now the nightmare ensues. Growing up in this business and, having, people above me and mentors to tell me to kind of be wary of certain things, I was once told there are 2 violations that can hurt you the most. 1, compete an ineligible kid, and number 2, run into problems with financial aid. And those 2 things together are something that obviously stays on our radar.
The other issue you referred to is really a balance between the prospective student athletes' right to privacy and the desire for the institution to be aware of any serious run-ins with the law that student athlete had. Many folks may remember a case, this is probably 6, 7 years ago, it's been a while, where the University of Miami signed a kid, tremendous football player, who had a handful of felonies. And, the university was, as you could imagine, severely criticized for bringing a convicted felon into the ranks. But there's a delicate balance between, again, the right of privacy on the one hand, and on the other hand, the right of the institution to know if a prospective student athlete has a criminal record. And I'm not sure, I'll be honest, I don't know what the NCAA rule is. I'm not sure there is an NCAA rule. It may go institution by institution. But there is, as in most of these issues, a delicate balance that needs to be reached. I would argue that the institution should be aware of any felonies, at least. Misdemeanors, perhaps not, but felonies certainly, because you have to decide, is that student athlete worth the potential risk?
And there is no rule, just so everyone's aware from the NCAA's perspective. They concentrate primarily on academics in that initial and amateurism. There's an eligibility center which set up for clearance, looks at your high school GPA, your SAT, and then in addition to that, there's a series of amateurism questions, largely targeted to international students. And those two areas are what exists for that clearance to the NCAA. They haven't gone into the delinquency or those issues.
There's one point that, please stand up. I just was going to bring up a point that also came out. The Congressional Budget Office released in 2009 a report that warned the NCAA that it was endangering its tax-exempt status because of the bludgeoning commercialization of their teams. The CBO estimated to be 60 to 80% of the money made through the NCAA football teams. So basically, this voluntary non-tax exemption that the NCAA has is really in question. In my view, with the right advocates at the right time, that can be totally knocked out. I'm sorry, go ahead.
This will be our last question.
My question was about runners, people who aren't agents but are affiliated with them, and if the NCAA is taking a look at anything regarding that. And there have been some famous names in the past, like Sonny Vaccaro, and more recently the Pump Brothers and William Wesley. I wonder what's being done about these people.
Here's one of the things out there. Scumball agents, tons of them. More than let's say, putting the percentages, probably in the 90s. I'm talking about the ones you hear about that are legitimate. You tell me how, if I'm going into an offensive tackle and I'm going to guarantee him $90,000 worth of merchandising, that means going out and getting him products, and I can pass through the NCAA, the NFLPA sanctions of not allowed to give him money, how that can be justified. I'm never going to make up $90,000, $150,000 for this guy who's going to be a first-round draft choice, and I'm going to get 3% of his money. That's where the deal is. So, even in situations that are clean under the rules, situations, they're still shady. There's still something about them. And with the new NFLPA that's going on, I'm not sure where the line's going to be drawn. I know Gene Upshaw, a lot of good and bad about him, a union boss in the legal and practical sense, but he was very, very difficult on agents. But he would also be able to, with his buddies, to turn his head the other way.
Well, Ralph, you know exactly what both the NFL and I think NFLPA, which is no longer a union, they've decertified. You know exactly what they want to do with agents, the same thing the NBA did, which is the NFL wants to slot all their top-rated draft choice, effectively designating the salary, which removes the necessity of having an agent for your first contract. Second contract, different story, but first contract, yep. Their desire, and they're open about it. So you and your colleagues, as you're well aware, are under attack.
I'm semi-retired here.
Because the NFL, but you're under attack from both sides, from management, right, the NFL, but also from the NFLPA, because their client is not the agent, their client is the player. So
Their client, the NFLPA's duty is owed to the organization as a whole, not to any individual player. So
it's owed to the players, the members of the NFL Players Association, when it was a union, and at some point it'll certify again. But the members are the players,
yeah, without question.
not the agents.
But they don't represent any of the individual interests of the players.
Not true. If I'm an NFL player and I've got a grievance against the club, not now with the decertification, but the union, as you well know, the union would help they'd represent my grievance against the Oilers or against the Chargers or whomever, right?
Let's go back to the classic statement of Gene Upshaw with the alumni group. Who's he represent?
I'm not saying alumni are part of that group.
No, well, but current players as a whole, there's a difference between my representing a class and my representing one individual.
No, I understand. I don't disagree.
They represent the players as a class, not as individuals, and that's, I think, pretty well established.
Yeah, no, I don't disagree. But, I mean, for the benefit of the students here, as you watch the NFL labor negotiations play out, one of the interesting outcomes, I think, will be that they'll slot first, second round players, much like the NBA does, so that will remove effectively the need for an agent.
And see, I don't see that happening, and I don't really care. I mean, I have old-time clients. I have Jeff Saturday, James Ferry, and a bunch of other guys, and I don't go out and recruit. I haven't been out recruiting. I'll take on referrals, and I like to do a little bit of it that way. One of the things, though, where's the money? How big is this business with the NCAA? I'd like maybe a parting shot. Is it $100 million? Over the term of their contracts, $8 billion, $10 billion. You hear everything thrown around. What about the coaches? Why are they cheating? Why are they breaking all the rules that are out there? What do you think they're getting paid that you know about? How about our boy Nicky? $6 million. He doesn't put it down at $6 million. He puts $5,997,349, and I guarantee you the booster clubs, when they're shaking hands with him, it's not that $4,000 that the Auburn players were getting put in their hand. It's a heck of a lot more, and a lot of these boys would come down with a simple IRS investigation. Okay, I'm done.
So to
Boosters
conclude,
aren't permit to supplement coaches' income.
So to conclude, I think we've established that this is a very, very difficult game. The NCAA enforcement and infractions game, it's something that is really difficult to comply with. It's something that could be viewed as, I think Ralph would view it as hypocritical, and it's something that is the world as we know it today. Maybe a new panel in a new day will be what would be better, what could be put in place. But for now, I want to thank our guests. Everyone, thank you very much.
Well, thanks a lot. Appreciate it. Maybe another time.